Hello.
Here is a PowerPoint. So once the PowerPoint begins, I'm not going to actually see anybody. So Elliot, if you could just sort of speak audibly so I know that someone's asking a question, I'll stop talking and go back to that. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit, I am going to, hang on one second, cancel, hang on. I'm going to go to share screen, share my screen. Excellent. And then I'm going to start the from the beginning. So let me just tell you a little bit about how we got, hang on, from the beginning. There we go. So let me tell you a little bit, oh look, I can still see you actually. Let me tell you a little bit about how we got here. I had a conversation with the rabbi some many months ago when he gave a Devar Torah that talked about the obviousness of Jews being a nation. And I said, well, you know, it's certainly a reasonable argument, but I didn't see it as being obvious at all. And, you know, I actually had spent some many years researching the beginning of Zionism, and it was actually quite a hard sell for the Zionists to convince people that they were a nation. So what I argued, you know, and I gave them the example of the guy you see on your left. On the bottom left of your screen is a very young, dapper, and handsome Samson Raphael Hirsch. And he was known as something of an expert on Hebrew language, on the language of the Bible, the Torah. And he, I think, knew that the word Am appeared many times, and yet he denied that the Jews constituted a nation in the political sense. He was an anti-Zionist. So I thought, it's not so simple. I think these things are more complicated. So what we decided to do is to have a little bit of a two-parter on the impact of modernity on Jews, and specifically the impact of two events that began in the 19th century. Number one, emancipation, meaning to say the release of Jews from the control of the autonomous community, the integration of Jews, the legal equalization of the Jews and their integration legally into European society. And combined with that, the impact of the Enlightenment, which in the Jewish version is called the Haskalah. The impact of these two things, emancipation and the destruction of Jewish autonomy on the one hand, and the Enlightenment on the other, essentially destroys pre-modern Jewishness. I won't say Judaism, it's a loaded word, but Jewishness, the nature of being a Jew, was utterly and totally destroyed. And what had to happen was, it had to be reconstructed. Jews had to figure out what it means to be a Jew for the first time in a very long time. It's what one scholar called the heretical imperative. Everybody was a heretic. Everybody had to figure out what it meant to be a Jew, and it had been quite obvious. And this leads to a whole set of new ideologies and institutions to embody and defend them. And the way I broke up, Elliot and I spoke a lot about how we wanted to do this. So we decided to break it up into two sessions. Today, we're going to talk about the impact on Western Europe, which is the first place where you see emancipation, the first place where you see enlightenment affecting Jewish society. And then next week, we'll talk about Eastern Europe and specifically Zionism. I could talk about socialism and other things as well, but I'm going to focus next week specifically on Zionism. The principle underlying everything I'm going to say for today and for next week is that all forms of modern Jewishness are constructions. All of them claim authenticity. All of them say, we are the most authentic form of Jewishness. We are the place where, I don't know, Moses would come or Maimonides would come or whoever. We are the real Jews. And the others are they're not getting it right. The others are getting it wrong. But I'm also going to argue and demonstrate a little bit that they're all going to pick and choose. All forms of modern Jewishness are going to select some traditions over others, some rituals over others, some texts over others, some textual interpretations over others, some history over others, some heroes over others, and so on and so on. And they're all going to do it differently, and they're all going to claim that their own version is obviously correct, that their own version is obviously what God wants or what history wants or whatever it may be. So today we're going to look first of all at Western Europe, and we're going to do it in the grand tradition of teaching, which I was taught by my teacher. The connection. Are we back?
It's hard to hear you.
Audio. Can you hear me again? Elliot, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Thumbs up. No, it's frozen. I think my internet might be unstable.
We can hear you. We can hear you. So I think if you go back to sharing and maybe save your bandwidth and maybe disable your camera, but share and save your bandwidth for the audio, that might work better. Oh, I think we just lost it.
I keep losing it. I'm going to go to a different room if you don't mind. If you can wait just a minute and try to get to a better connection.
Josh, is anything of what you're going to be doing relevant to Jews from Arab countries, Mizrahi Jews?
Yes and no, not directly. I can't in 2 weeks talk about everything. By the way, is this connection better? I think it is. I'm stepping upstairs now, so it should hopefully be a better connection. Let's try this. Okay. And hopefully this is a more stable connection. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this is a better connection. Phenomenal. I think the basement just was a bad connection. So it's not directly connected to Mizrahi, except insofar as the Mizrahi Jews, when they confront modernity, are also going to have to reconstruct their Jewishness. That's a phenomenon that's everywhere. But I'm not going to directly talk about that during these 2 weeks because there's a limit to what I can do. So in the grand tradition what did we learn when we went to grad school? Tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. So here's what I'm going to tell you today. We're going to talk about the beginning of modern Judaism in Western Europe, and specifically Germany, because that's where most modern Jewish denominations are born. We're going to look how it developed with some critical texts and see the similarities and differences between them. And then next week, we're going to see what happens when emancipation comes to Eastern Europe. It's a very, very different story over there. I think I need to reshare my screen if I'm not mistaken, because I was logged out again. So I'm going to do that again right now. And you should be able to see the PowerPoint again. So here it is. Phenomenal. So this, from the beginning, show the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so let's get started. So as I was saying, the 19th century sees the collapse of the autonomous community, the collapse of Jewish autonomy, and Jews have to figure out what it means. And that's going to give us the beginning of religious change. And for the first time since the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Pharisees, we're going to have religious denominations. We're going to have core disagreements about basic questions of Judaism that really haven't plagued Jewish society in quite a long time. And so we're going to begin in this place, in Westphalia. When France takes over most of Europe, they reorganize Central Europe. They create this kingdom of Westphalia. And Napoleon Bonaparte puts his brother Jerome in charge. And Jerome decides he's going to bring the enlightenment of France to Germany, or to the German states. And he assigns this guy right here, Israel Jacobson, who's not a rabbi. He is enlightened inclined, and he is in charge of the Jews of Westphalia. And he uses that power, just as France had created a consistory, a kind of organization of all the Jews. He's in charge of the consistory of Jews in Westphalia, and he uses that power to create a new what's called in German a gebildete Judaism. It means a kind of educated, refined Judaism. You can see this, the temple he creates, and he calls it a temple deliberately, not a synagogue, right? The idea being this is the focus of our worship. And you can see from the outside, you can hardly tell it's a synagogue, and very provocatively and interestingly includes a steeple on top, right? Now, in many ways, the Sison temple and the Judaism he creates was quite different. Look at the changes he adds. He has a German language sermon. And the German, unlike a regular traditional sermon, which is either a roaming prediger, a preacher who gives fire and brimstone, or it's some kind of a rabbinic discourse, which is what, forgive me, what Woody Allen would call intellectual masturbation, right? In other words, you take a verse of Talmud and a verse of Mishnah and a verse of this and a verse of that, and you weave them together in some glorious, perfect sermon that shows how really they all come from the one living God, just to show how smart you are. No, the new language is going to be, first of all, German, and it's going to be patriotic. It's going to be edifying and organized and inspiring. It's going to be the kind of sermon that each and every one of you listens to every week, probably, but it was a new thing back then. The synagogue is going to have decorum. We're going to rise and sit at the same time. We're going to sing together. It's not going to be cacophony. There's going to be music. There's going to be an organ, but played by a non-Jew. And there's going to be a new education that's going to be balanced between secular and Torah studies. Now, I want to emphasize there is nothing wrong with any of this. There is no halachic problem with anything he did, but it was still quite path-breaking. He was exceedingly careful not to cross halacha as far as he understood it, although he told the rabbis, you're going to take it or else. I mean, he gave them a threat. He said, you're going to start promoting patriotism and serving in the army or else. He definitely used his power, but there was nothing anti-halachic going on here. It lasts a few years. You might have heard the news. If you didn't, I'm going to, spoiler alert, Napoleon lost. He was thrown out. So that was the end of the Sison temple. So these guys come back to go back home, and they want to do it again. So they create in Hamburg the first proper reformed temple. And look at it. It's quite interesting. It's lovely. It's got decorum. They dress up. I want to emphasize to you, the women are in the balcony and the men downstairs. There's not family pews. However, the Hamburg temple was different than Sison. Here they start fooling around. They start playing with more than that. Here's their constitution, which I want to read to you a little bit of it. Or maybe even the whole thing. Let's see how fast I can read. Since public worship, by the way, all of my texts, I was very lazy. I took pictures with my phone and uploaded it to the PowerPoint. I did not feel like retyping it. So if it's blurry, I need a better phone. What can I tell you? Since public worship for some time has been neglected because of the ever-decreasing knowledge of the language in which it alone has until now been conducted. In other words, nobody knows Hebrew anymore, and it's gotten really bad and boring, and everyone hates it, blah, blah, blah. We're going to have this new temple. If you look towards on the bottom left, they're going to plan it. It's going to be dignified, well-ordered ritual on the Sabbath and holy days and other solemn occasions, in their own temple on the top of the right column. To be erected for this purpose, we're going to have a German language sermon, choral singing, and the accompaniment of an organ. These are the things you want to look for in modern Judaism. Incidentally, the above mentioned ritual should not be confined to services in the temple, but to all religious customs and active daily life, which are sanctified by the church, meaning the Jewish church, or by their nature. Outstanding among these, the entrance of the newly born into the covenant of the fathers, which I want to emphasize does not mean bris milah. It means some kind of ceremony for boys and girls to parallel baptism, weddings and the like, anything like that. A religious ceremony shall be introduced in which the children of both sexes, after having received adequate schooling and the teachings of their faith, shall be accepted as confirmants of the Mosaic religion, right? In other words, this is not bar and bat mitzvah. We are 100 years from a bat mitzvah. This is a confirmation ceremony in the dogma and the catechism of the church of Judaism. They're playing around. They don't know what the hell they're doing, but they're trying to figure it out. This is early on, again, 1817. So a lot of new radical reforms. They have actually a prayer book that goes shockingly from left to right. they have an organ, they have a sermon, and ideological changes. They start excising prayers they don't like. Chief among them, anything that talks about Messiah, anything that talks about going back to the land of Israel, anything that talks about the temple. All of these things are going to be excised. This got people's attention. This got people's attention. And you start seeing the congealment of Orthodox and Reform positions. Now, I don't have time right now to go into the whole history of the term Orthodox. Briefly, it was a term that comes out of the Protestant Enlightenment, and it originally meant, it literally means right thinking, right beliefs, and it was a very interesting history how it goes from being an anti-Enlightenment term to a term referring to these Jews as you know them today who keep the laws strictly and so on. I don't have time to go into it. It's a very interesting history. It happens around, let's say 1808, 1810, something like that, is approximately when Orthodox starts taking the meaning of what you know it today to mean this denomination. The temple in Hamburg gets people's attention. Here's how you see some response to it. This is Ele Divrei Abrit. These are the words of the covenant, which is a response to Hamburg. And you see the three cardinal sins. What are the three cardinal sins? One, it's forbidden to change the worship that is customary in Israel from the morning benedictions to Aleinu L'Shabech. It is our duty to praise, and all the more so to make any deletions. That's number one cardinal sin. You can't change any prayers. Number two, it's forbidden to pray in any language besides Hebrew. If it's a prayer book that's printed improperly with anything else, it's forbidden to use it. Forbidden to use it if it has any other language in it. Three, it's prohibited to play a musical instrument even when played by a non-Jew. I want to emphasize, these are funny cardinal sins. They're not all completely against halakha quite clearly. We have rabbis amongst us that can comment on it, but I would say these are not shockingly anti-halachic, certainly playing an organ with a non-Jew playing it or praying in English or in German. But it was really about the idea of something new is happening, and therefore our response to it has to be different. This is one of the things that makes, one of many things that makes Orthodoxy different than pre-modern Judaism. Orthodoxy is a response to reform in many concrete ways. I'll give you a few examples as we go along. Now, there's two general possible Orthodox responses to this day. There's many permutations of these, but essentially there is an anti-modern backlash, which we'll see, right? You can't change anything, right? Even if we used to change things, that was then, this is now. You cannot change anything. Modernity itself is forbidden. Or you could say, no, we are going to modernize, but it has to be within a framework that upholds Jewish law as we understand it. We'll come back to those down the line. So that's sort of my first phase of changes. And again, this is the context of early 1800s. Emancipation has already happened in France. It's beginning to happen in England. It's slowly happening in the various German states and elsewhere in Western Europe. But the autonomous community, the autonomous community, by the way, was not a ghetto. It was a legal structure in which Jews lived for centuries that told them what it was to be a Jew, in which an oligarchic alliance of rabbis and wealthy elite ran the show. That was breaking down as Jews were integrated into the state and as they were confronting the Enlightenment, which is just to say, on the one hand, the ability of any kind of authority to impose Jewishness on the Jews was being depleted at precisely the moment that Jews were exposed to Enlightenment ideas and might want to screw around with what it meant to be a Jew. They had, in other words, the compulsion, the need to figure out when to be a Jew with the freedom to do so. That is the critical mixture that's going to make modern Jewishness. And I'm going to begin now. I'm very cognizant of the time. I want to leave time for questions. So now I'm looking at the second phase. This is, by the way, a picture of the new Jewish synagogue in Berlin, the greatest edifice of Reform Judaism ever created before the Holocaust. One of them anyway. Maybe Budapest is better, but it was a beautiful, beautiful structure that was sadly destroyed by the Nazis. And even here, I want to point out to you, besides the beauty of it, that the men are down below and the women are in the balconies. We still do not have mixed pews. Part of the point of these new synagogues, as we'll see, is to show that they could build it. The reason you build a grand edifice is to show we are part of the topography of this place. We have made it. We are part of Germany. We are part of France. We are part of England. We are part of America, etc. So how do I want to think about religious change overall in the 19th century? These are a picture of some of the men, and it's mostly men to be fair, who created modern Judaism. And I think the best way to approach it is by thinking about this, Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism. Essentially a bunch of kids. I'm 48 now, I get to call them kids. They're like 20, so I figure I can, my own kids are that age now, so I can say the word. I've been saying it for 30 years, but now I can really say it. A bunch of kids go to college, they go to university, and they're learning about how to read a text. They're learning historical thinking, right? That you don't bring prejudice. You look at the text. What does it say, right? What is it? Don't give me what it has to be saying. Don't bring your biases to it. What does the text say? And at the time, Jews and others were privileging certain texts like the Bible and saying, well, you can't read the Bible that way. It comes from God. You can't read the Talmud that way. It comes from God. You can't read traditions that way, right? They're holier. You privilege them. And these were secular Jews. And they said, you know, why? Why am I privileging these things? I want to take this scientific method that we've all been learning now and apply it to Jewish texts. I want to apply it to Judaism. Here's one of their early texts, right? One of their sort of declarations of independence, if you will. The science of Judaism comprehends Judaism in its fullest scope. It unfolds Judaism in accordance with its essence, describes it systematically, back to the whole. It treats the object of study in and for itself, for its own sake, not for any definite intention, not to figure out God's will, without any preconceived opinion, without caring about the final result. Because until now, when Jews read texts, they read them to, if there was a issue in a text that would show that the text was, that the Bible had multiple authors, or that the Talmud was inspired by something different than the author of the Bible, or whatever, that Judaism evolved over many, many centuries. The goal of reading the text properly is to show how, no, seemingly, that's the big word in Judaism, seemingly this suggests the Bible was written by multiple authors. Seemingly this suggests that the authors of the Talmud had a different idea about God than the authors of the medieval philosophy texts and so on. But actually, if you squint just right, if you understand it just right, we can harmonize it. And they said, no, I'm not going to harmonize anything. I just want to know what the text says, what the tradition says. So one way we can think of modern Jewish denominations is, do they accept this? To what extent do they accept the science? By the way, this is the birth of Jewish studies. This is the birth of my job. This is the birth of Sam's job. This is the birth of the field of Jewish studies as an academic discipline, right? And so one of the things we have to think about from denominations is, do they accept it? To what extent do they accept it? That's one way of sort of getting our hands around this. So what does Reformed Judaism say? All of Judaism is subject to critical science. Both the written Bible and all of the oral tradition texts, the Talmud and the medieval texts and so on and so forth. Thus, if it's all subject to science, if you find a ritual or a tradition that is edifying, that makes you better, great. And if not, don't. But here's the thing. If you are a Christian, Muslim, or Jew, and you want to suggest, as Reform and every other Jew does, that your version of Jewishness is the correct one, you need to play the proof text game. You have to bring proof texts, and the Reform can bring them. Look, we've been writing books for 4,000 years. We got all the texts we need. So what do they bring? It's a famous text that you all know. He has told, from Micah 6:8, right? He has told you, O man, what is good, what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk modestly with your God. It's pretty darn clear. What does God want? Only do justice, love goodness, and walk modestly with your God. I couldn't be clearer. Now, if you know your Bible, you know that the context of this quotation is ethical monotheism. It was God criticizing the Israelites because, they would kick an orphan in the gut on the way to the temple to bring their goat, or they'd kick a widow in the face and spit. I'm being alliterative here. They weren't good people. They were terrible people. And God said, you're missing the point. If you're not a good person, all the rituals in the world are meaningless, right? But they pluck this out of context and they say it's pretty darn clear, right? What does God want? Be a mensch. Zaya mensch. That's it, Zaya mensch. And I have lots of texts. You can do it. They had a series of conferences in Germany in the 1840s. Here they're talking about messianism. What do we do with the Messiah? And he said, well, in the olden days, the Messiah was their hope. They were hovering in the ghettos, suffering, and the Messiah was their great hope of being redeemed. But now in the bottom right corner, now our concepts have changed, right? Now there's no need for all of this extended ceremonial law. The earlier approach was about the land of Israel. The deity enjoyed bloody sacrifices. Priests were needed, etc., etc. But everyone knows the passage. It has been told to thee, O man, what is good, right? The decline of Israel's political independence was at one time deplored, but it was not a misfortune, a mark of progress, not a degradation, but an elevation. The place of the sacrifices has been taken by sacred devotion. And for them, by only the Talmud moves in circles, we favor progress. Hence Reform Judaism. And what about our co-nationals who are not Jews? How do we deal with them? How do we deal with them? How do we deal with love for the fatherland, love for mankind, love for our fellow Jews? So read what Samuel Holdheim writes here on the right-hand side. He traces the commandment of recognition and love of fellow countrymen back to the Pentateuch, to the Chumash, with a love for the Israelite for the Israelite does not refer to their common religion, but their common peoplehood. What was once a commandment for the Israelite with regard to his fellow Israelite must also oblige us with regard to our contemporary compatriots, to the Germans. The doctrine of Judaism is thus, first your compatriots, your Vaterlandsgenosse, and then your co-religionists, your Glaubensgenosse. The Jew acknowledges every man as his brother, but he acknowledges his fellow countryman to be one with whom he is connected by a particular bond. German Jew and German non-Jew share a particular bond that comes before all else. That's the new approach. These are new questions that Jews never had to figure out, unless you think those darn Reformed Jews, just wait and see. It's not just them, it's everybody. Just wait and see. All right, now we come number two, positive historical Judaism, which kind of overlaps today with conservative Judaism. The written Torah, they said, that's outside history. That's outside science. You can't analyze that the way you analyze Shakespeare or something like that. But the oral law, being a human product of human beings, is not above science. And in this way, they hope to link integrity and progress, selective preservation of the oral law. By the way, this continues all the way to this day. I'm not going to get into the details now, but if you look at the conservative responsa on how to deal with homosexuality, which came out about, 10 years ago now, give or take, plus minus, it's fascinating. But it's based completely on this principle, that the written Torah is strictly divine and you can't screw with it, but the oral Torah is not. The oral Torah is far more flexible. It's an exceedingly interesting responsa. If you have not read it and the subject interests you, I couldn't recommend it more. It's very interesting. So here is Zacharias Frankel, the father of conservative Judaism, talking about, have you noticed that everybody thinks they're a moderate? I've noticed it. Everyone thinks they're moderate, right? Everyone to your right is an extremist fanatic, and everyone to your left is a heretic. But it's certainly true with positive historical Judaism, and certainly true with Zacharias Frankel in the 1800s. Here he says in the bottom left, we have reached the starting point for the consideration of the current parties in Judaism. The Orthodox Party is clear. It has grown up in pious activity. To it, the performance of precepts is inseparable from faith, for to it, the two are closely and inwardly connected. Were it to tear itself away from observance and give up the precepts, it would be estranged from its own self on the upper right-hand side, as though plunged into an abyss. Given this viewpoint, the direction and emphasis of the Orthodox Party is clear. Where else, save in the continuation of faith and meticulous observance of the precepts, can it find complete satisfaction which it has enjoyed in the heritage of the fathers? When it will reject that which is no long kept holy and inviolable? No, it's unthinkable. So you have the super strict Orthodox. Then the next paragraph, I won't read it, he says is the Reform. And they're a bunch of heretics who throw away all religious rituals. We don't even have time for those heretics. They're terrible. Now we come in the next paragraph to the third party, right? This party, he says, bases itself upon rational faith. Mind you, the Reform, irrational. The Orthodox, irrational. We are rational. I have to emphasize here, by the way, again, for the millionth time, everybody thinks that they're rational and others are idiots. Everyone thinks they are authentic and others are heretics. I know that you probably think that sounds like the Orthodox, but I don't think it's other people. I'm telling you, it is. You know, Ismar Shorsh, the great former dean of the Jewish Theological Seminary, a brilliant scholar and leader for many, many, many years of Jewish Theological Seminary, he came to Synagogue Bethel, which is the synagogue in which I grew up in Highland Park, and he gave a lecture maybe 15 years ago now. I'm telling you on my honor, the title of the lecture was Why Conservative Judaism is the Authentic Form of Judaism. That was the title of the lecture. As it should be, because if you didn't think it was the authentic form, you're in the wrong place. You should go somewhere else. Reform Judaism likewise thinks they are the authentic Jews. Other people are getting it totally wrong. And you'll see next week, the Zionists, and there's many factions of Zionists, are going to do the same thing. They are going to pick and choose from the tradition and build a new Judaism. And they're going to say, of course, this is Judaism. The rest of you who don't see it are heretics, right? We'll come back to that next week. But I really want to emphasize that point. There is no real Judaism. Who said it first? You all pick your poison, right? You've all picked your poison. There is no real Judaism. These are all we're all just a bunch of blind people grasping at straws. But this is their straw. We're the rational faith. We recognize that Judaism is about action, but it shall not be, he writes, empty of spirit, merely mechanical. Note the inference. The Orthodox, he says, are empty of spirit and merely mechanical. Notice what he's doing there, right? It has to have religion, but also spirituality. The Reform have only spirituality. The Orthodox have only ritual. We are the beautiful center. That's what he says. So much for Zacharias Frankel. Elliot, what time is it? Wait, it's about 7:30 or so? How are we doing in time?
You're doing great.
Clock.
Keep going.
Keep going. Stop me if I go too long. Then we come to the Orthodox. So for the Orthodox, for Hirsch, of course, he says, to a certain extent, neither the written nor the oral Torah can be subjected to critical science. Don't tell me that because there's a JPQRSTWXZ, right, author of the Bible. Don't give me that. He says, you think the rabbis are idiots? They noticed that Genesis was written differently than Leviticus. They're not idiots. They noticed Deuteronomy had a different language. They noticed it looked suspiciously similar to part of Isaiah, but they had other explanations for it. You can't subject it to science that way. But I want to emphasize, he was a maskil. He was a very enlightened person who promotes lots of the ideals of the Enlightenment. His hero was not only the Chazal of the Talmud, his hero was also Moses Mendelssohn, the famous Enlightenment Jew, right? By the way, all of whose descendants are Christians. But that was a real Jew, observant of Jewish law, learned, studied, but also completely immersed in secular culture, right? So look how he dressed. Look how Hirsch dressed. To this day, a lot of the people in this denomination, if you've ever been to Washington Heights, to the Breuer Synagogue, they still dress this way, right? And also the famous first chief rabbi, Adler of England. They called him the Right Reverend Adler, the Right Reverend. That was his title, right? This is orthodoxy, right? This is a construction. He says, of course, we're going to have an edifying sermon in the German language with the rabbi facing the congregation at the bema at the front of the synagogue. Of course, we're going to pray in unison. Of course, we're going to kick out the kids who are making noise. Of course, we're going to ban things like, chaos on Purim. Of course, at one time, he wanted to cut out Aleinu. At one time, Hirsch, then he pulled back from that. But at one time, Hirsch wanted to cut out the Aleinu prayer, right? And he absolutely, what is your nationality for Hirsch? You're German. You're German. Now, I don't want to get into the details, the difference between religion, ethnicity, tribe, and the language they use in German, but he was anti-Zionist for sure when Zionism comes on later on. He was an integrated Jew. You're supposed to speak German. You're supposed to go to college and get a degree, get a doctorate. You're supposed to be a productive, a member of German society. And he said all of this is sanctioned by Jewish law. Nina, you have your, thank you. Is sanctioned by Jewish law. So he says, when Frankel attacked him, for being, he said, choosing between progress and religion. He says, if I had to choose, look what he writes in the upper left corner, between that craziness and simple ignorance. Yeah, I'll be ignorant. I'm not going to give up the Torah. He says, but you're an idiot because there's no such dilemma, right? Judaism never remained aloof from true civilization and progress. In almost every era, its adherents were fully abreast of contemporary learning and very often excelled their contemporaries. I'm not going to get into the details. Suffice to say, this is not an historical representation of Jewish history, but whatever. Maimonides certainly was, but I mean, this is not how history went, but whatever. That's his reconstruction. If in recent centuries, the last few hundred years were the exception when German Jews were totally aloof, but it wasn't their fault. They were shoved into ghettos. It wasn't their fault, blah, blah, blah. But now that we're freed in the wonderful new world, I mean, you got to ask yourself, man, if you're praying for 2,000 years for salvation because your life is so terrible and you are oppressed, man, you are oppressed, and you pray for salvation, and suddenly you are emancipated. You are equal. There's no Holocaust yet. There's not really much anti-Semitism. You are being freed from the ghetto, given equal rights. By 1870, Jews in Germany were something like 95% middle class, secure, well-living middle class, most of them upper middle class. So you think that the prayer for redemption, you don't think that has a religious significance. Of course it does, right? Of course it does. Praying for salvation when you're very happy in Berlin and comfortable is a very different thing than praying when you're in a literal ghetto in Germany. Now here's the problem. Judaism always has deviance. It's not like our texts don't deal with deviance, right? But what are you supposed to do when you're the deviant? You're the deviant. 80% of German Jews are mechalel Shabbos b'faresia, break the Sabbath publicly. Now, according to Jewish texts, that makes you a deviant. You're a heretic. According to Judaism, you can't be counted in the minyan, let alone married to a Jew in good standing. You are out. And there's a lot of consequences to that. But also, what does it mean to be an authentic Jew when you're freely choosing this lifestyle? It's a very different kind of Judaism than when everyone is just doing it. When you're choosing to not break the Sabbath, when breaking it brings no consequences whatsoever, that's a very different lifestyle. And what do you do with the rest of the Jews? With Klal Yisrael, with pluralism, right? So here's the problem. 80% of the Jews, 90% of the Jews are breaking Shabbos publicly. They don't keep kosher, et cetera, et cetera. You're the crazy one. Well, there's two possibilities. Hirsch was quite clear. The texts are clear. They've abandoned us. They are a different denomination. They are more different than us, he argued to Parliament, to Bismarck himself. They are more different than us than Catholics to Protestants. We want a separate community from them with separate institutions. Remember, in Europe, Jewish community is not just a voluntary community. You had to belong to the Jewish community, and there was only one per town. They taxed you. To this day, they tax you. When I moved to Vienna in 1999, you had to have what's called a Meldezettel, and an announcement note. It means you went to the police and they know where to find you. And on that Meldezettel, which I went to, I was a chas at the time. I looked very much like Rabbi Ettlinger on the right, although my beard wasn't quite so white yet. It was pretty black. But I looked like him with a black hat, no less, which I would never leave the house without, and a black gartel. And I went to the police station. And first of all, he asked me in German, "What's your religion?" And I looked at him and said, "Take one guess." But then he wrote down Jewish, right? And why did he write down Jewish? Because everyone is taxed by their religion. You're taxed. You're a member of the Jewish community. So it's a legal category. And Hirsch said, I can't be with these people. They're not Jews. I mean, they might be halakhically Jews, but they're not in good standing. Ettlinger said, quote, like, if you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, imagine Larry David. I mean, maybe the first rabbis, right, who had an education, maybe that first generation. He says, but since then, he digs up this old category from Maimonides. They're like children raised by barbarians. They don't know what they're doing. They're idiots. They're not knowledgeable. They're still good Jews. They don't know better. And if that's your approach, okay, we can count them in the minyan and stay in the community with them and all those good things. This debate between Rav Hirsch and Ettlinger comes down to this very day. If you know your former chief rabbi Sachs of England, one of his books, he talks about peoplehood, one people. And he says, we have a problem. How can we have pluralism? Because if I recognize Reformed Jews as being smart, intelligent, educated, adult people, choosing their lifestyle because that's what they find most satisfying and edifying and appropriate, I am forced by Judaism to ban them heretics and expel them from my presence. If, however, I say they're tinek shenishba, they don't know what they're doing, they're just ignoramuses, I can welcome them, but I'm in a pretty darn insulting way, right? I've told them they're idiots. And he says, I choose B. I know it's insulting, but I want peoplehood. But that's the choice that by the way, there's an answer out of this conundrum. I'll give you a secret. The answer is humility. The answer is not being 100% sure you're correct. And then you can include the other you can include them without necessarily acknowledging that, without degrading them. But humility isn't the hallmark of most rabbis. We're very blessed in Skokie Valley, but most rabbis are not known for the, and also with Rabbi Belinsky, since he's with us, I'll honor him as well. But most rabbis aren't famous for their humility. So certainly Rabbi Hirsch did not have it, Rabbi Maimonides did not have it, and Rabbi Sachs it doesn't seem to have it. Anyway, that's the problem of orthodoxy. Now, of course, this isn't the only form of orthodoxy. You also have ultra-orthodoxy, right? And they too have their proof texts, and they have many proof texts. I'm going to give you my favorite, which is from Moses Sofer, the Chatam Sofer, who said, all new is forbidden by the Torah. What does this come from? Kol Chadash Asur Min Torah. So Chadash Asur Min Torah is from the Talmud, where it's talking about the wheat harvest, that you can't use wheat from the new harvest until you've brought your wheat contribution Passover time, the Omer offering, right? At Passover time. That's why if you go to the kosher bakeries in Chicago, they'll say Yashan, right? They'll say Yashan. This is old wheat. This is not new wheat. So he pulls it out of context and says, so there's a word missing from the Talmud, which is new wheat is forbidden by the Torah. But it's left out because the Talmud is a terse document and it's understood as talking about wheat from the context. He pulls it out and says, I don't know, man. I mean, it says new is forbidden by the Torah. So new is forbidden. That means new culture, new, not the technology, right? They're not Amish. The cultural content is forbidden by the Torah. He says, you can't speak German. You got to speak Yiddish, the language that Moses received the Torah in, I imagine, right? And you can't dress like everybody else. You got to dress with a shtreimel and a capote because that's how Moses would have dressed, I imagine, right? I'm joking, but I'm being serious as well. So if you look, for example, here is Akiva Schlesinger, a famous ultra-Orthodox rabbi, one of the founders of Petach Tikva, by the way, an interesting loop between ultra-Orthodoxy and pre-Zionism. He founded Petach Tikva. But anyway, Schlesinger says, when Sofer's talking about, he quotes this famous midrash. You know, Judaism is so blessed with midrash. You know, we have so many traditions, and we have a tradition of traditions. We have a tradition of what traditions actually guide our behavior in an authoritative voice, and what are, you know, it's a nice idea. You know, it's inspiring. So there's a tradition of, in what merit did the Jews get redeemed from Egypt? And there's a couple of versions of it in the Midrash, but the most famous one is they didn't change their name or their language or their clothes. These three things: their name or the language, meaning to say they didn't acculturate, and therefore God redeemed them. A nice midrash, but for Sofer and for Schlesinger, it's not just a midrash. This is a commandment. You want to be redeemed, this is what you have to do. It means if your name is Aaron, don't go by Adolf, unless you laugh, Adolf, ha, ha, ha. Adolf was an incredibly popular Jewish name. Most of the early Zionists, Adolf, if you go to the first Zionist Congress, there's a lot of Adolfs who went to the first Zionist Congress. It was a very popular Jewish name. For some reason, the last 75 years, it hasn't been so popular. I don't know, people don't use it so much anymore, but it was for a very long time a very popular Jewish name. It's actually a funny story about names. Jews like to use, as they're acculturating, like to use non-Jewish names because they think it makes them fit in better. And then non-Jews start noticing that Jews are doing it, and there's a sense of, you know, there goes the neighborhood, right? And so what happens is Jews don't realize that, and for another few decades, they're still using the name even though nobody else is. So Sigmund, for example. Sigmund used to be a very common German name, but eventually becomes a Jewish name. Or Seymour, right? Seymour is the ultimate Jewish name, right? See, if your name's Seymour or Sheldon, you know, you're probably born like in the 30s or 40s and in New York, and your parents were immigrants, and you know, it's a certain age if your name is Seymour or Sheldon. Sigmund was, if your name is Sigmund, you were born in the 1880s and 90s, your parents were first generation middle-class German speakers and so on. So anyway, if your name is Aaron, you can't go by Adolf, right? And you have to speak Yiddish, and you can't change your clothes. These things are prohibited, but not Greek, Aramaic, or Arabic. Those things are okay. Greek, Aramaic, and Arabic are okay, but nothing else. That's where it stops. Otherwise, it's forbidden, because we know that's how it comes. Fine, we'll go here. Now, I want to end, before I get to questions, with a paradox. On the one hand, this spectrum of Judaisms with which all of you are to one or another extent familiar, you know, they're quite different. You know, the Reform and Neo-Orthodox hold radically different views on whether the Torah comes from God, and therefore whether the halacha is binding as coming from God. But they were actually incredibly similar. Look at the Berlin Reformed temple on the left, and look at the Orthodox Viennese temple. That's the Seitenstädtgasse temple in Vienna. It's the only temple to survive the Holocaust. It was in the first district. It couldn't be burned down by the Nazis because it was in a tight inner city with buildings and all around. It would have burned the whole city down. So that's why it survived the Holocaust. The only one of 101 synagogues to survive the Holocaust in Vienna was the Seitenstädtgasse temple. That's Orthodox. That's Orthodox. What's the difference between them? It's hard to know, right? These denominations shared basic, not just aesthetic values, but basic Jewish values. They were both super rational, anti-Kabbalah, anti-Hasidic. They both believed in secular education. They both believed in the new style of rabbi who gave a sermon in the German language or in the vernacular language every week, not just twice a year, like was customary, but every week as a big part of his job. They believed in an orderly service. They believed in all of these things that made Judaism modern. They disagreed on halacha, it's true. But in most ways, the neo-Orthodox of Germany had far, 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 far more in common with the Reform of Germany than the neo-Orthodox had with the Jews of Eastern Europe. The so-called Orthodox Jews, but they weren't really Orthodox Jews of Eastern Europe. They had much more in common with the Reformed Jews in Germany. And that's interesting. And to make this new kind of Jewishness, right? Because they also are agreed that being a Jew is essentially a religious or ethnic category, not a national category. That's also new, by the way. right? One thing religion asks you is who's in your team and what is the meaning of that team and who's out of that team. And they answered it similarly, by the way. And they all had to establish innovative, modern infrastructure to create and sustain this new type of Jewishness. School systems, also the Reform, by the way, synagogues, voluntary associations, newspapers, and much more. And these things sustained this new kind of Jewishness in a way that was totally unprecedented. Just there's nothing in Jewish history that's like it, because there was nothing in Jewish history that was like this form of Jewishness. And this dominates Western Europe and America for many, 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 many decades. But for a variety of reasons, these forms of Jewishness have little headway in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe instead, the Jewishnesses, the Judaisms, the forms of Jewishness, the expressions of Jewishness, whatever word you want to use, that dominate are going to be expressions of modern Jewish politics. It's going to be things like political orthodoxy, which is different than what you think of as orthodoxy. Political orthodoxy, which is a form of ultra-orthodoxy. Various forms of Jewish socialism, but also Zionisms. And by the way, non-Zionist Jewish nationalisms. Zionism will appear in Eastern Europe as an answer to the question, what is a Jew and what is Judaism? And it's going to answer all the same questions that Reform and Conservative and Neo-Orthodox and Ettlinger and Hirsch, all those guys, it's going to answer all the same questions, but with radically different answers, but for the same purpose, to tell you what does it mean to be a Jew, what's expected of you, who's the bad Jew and who's the good Jew, what's the sacred past you should focus on, what's the destined future, what language should you use, what rituals are important, what texts are important, what traditions are important, and which ones can be discarded. It's going to do all of the same things as those denominations in Western Europe. It's going to reconstruct Judaism. They're all working, the parable I like to use, and I'll end with this, is that imagine your kids or grandkids building blocks. We still have, my kids are older now, but I save the blocks. I figure, God willing, someday I'll have grandkids. But I love blocks because there's no batteries and there's no plastic. They're simple wooden blocks of all different shapes, right? And from those wooden blocks, you can build a lot of edifices. You can make a parking lot or a synagogue or a hospital or a movie theater, or whatever you want. You can make a couch. You can make anything. My kids are very inventive. The blocks are real. Each individual block is real, but they're being put together in radically different ways. So what I mean is Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, Orthodoxy in all of its forms, and Zionism and socialism, these are all different constructions of the same pre-modern blocks that were bulldozed down by modernity. Emancipation, enlightenment, mass industrialization, urbanization, migration, anti-Semitism after the 1880s tore down the edifice that existed before the modern period. And Jews are picking up the pieces and rebuilding themselves in different ways. So I try to demonstrate that today with the Western denominations. I imagine hopefully I was somewhat convincing of you. Orthodoxy might have been a hard sell, but I hope I sold you on it. But next week, what I really want to show you is how Zionism does it. And I want to reemphasize, I don't argue for a moment that anyone is right or wrong. I can't know. After 120 years, hopefully God will tell us. But they're all picking and choosing in their own ways. And we all pick our poison. We'll pick the version of Jewishness that strikes us as some combination of convincing, compelling, and enlightening and edifying. But nobody really knows because pre-modern Judaism is gone. It's like Sartre said, the existentialist said, there's no exits. We all have to pick because not picking is also a choice. Not choosing is a choice. You have to choose. There's the heretical imperative, as Peter Berger put it. So I think I'll stop there. I'm going to unshare my screen so that we can all look at this. And I see it's very late, but I can stay. I'm sorry for going so late, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Josh, I'll kick it off. I thought that was
Sure.
an absolutely fabulous conversation. And I was really struck at the end by your comments about how, despite the extremely different views on divinity of text and halakhically, halakhically binding decisions, ritual, etc., that nonetheless Reform and Neo-Orthodoxy did share had a lot in common. And as you went through the particulars, it struck me that what they seem to have had in common was the integration of Enlightenment culture into the religious environment. And would you say that that's the sort of birth of cultural Judaism?
Well, it's an interesting question. First of the two questions. So the Enlightenment, yes. So all modern Judaisms in Germany, and later spreads to Western Europe and America. And actually in America, it was born of its own volition as well. But yes, they all are integrating Enlightenment ideals into Judaism itself as being Jewish, as being authentically Jewish, 100%. In terms of cultural Judaism, so that's going to come in a sense more from Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, there's more of a sense, and America as well, by the way, but in Western Europe, there's more of a sense of Judaism as a religion. And in Eastern Europe, there's going to be more of a sense of Judaism as something, not just a religion, as a peoplehood, as an ethnic group, as something different than religion, which is a more Western conception. And also, by the way, I would say someone asked about the Mizrahi at the very beginning, and I would say something of it there as well. You can get cultural Jewishness from that, in a sense. And Zionism will play that role. Where you see Zionism, certainly in Western Europe, but in my book, I argue it's in Eastern Europe as well. What it basically is, this is a teaser for next week, I guess, but it is a way of saying, let me illustrate it with an example. I once had a young woman came to my class, and she's wearing a big T-shirt, and it said IDF with a Star David or a flag or who the hell, whatever it was. Now, why is she wearing an IDF T-shirt? I didn't ask her, but I would venture to guess it was not because after class she was raising money with a little blue box for Israel or for the IDF. I would guess, thanks, Sam. I would guess that she was doing it to say, I know I'm not religious in any possible way. I know I don't keep kosher, I eat the same food as you, and I watch the same TV shows and movies, and I talk like you, and my Saturdays are spent with you on the beach, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm Jewish. I'm an authentic Jew, and you got to know that. And Zionism does that for Jews in both Western and Eastern Europe. It's a way of being authentically Jewish without need for ritual. Now, it will, as you all know, over the course of the 20th century, become integrated into other denominations, especially Orthodoxy, right? Religious Zionism becomes a thing. But in its origins, what Zionism really does is offer a cultural form of Jewishness that claims authenticity, and indeed superior authenticity, to an anti-Zionist Orthodox Jew. So I would say it comes more from Eastern Europe than West, but it certainly becomes everywhere with time. Yeah. But there are other ways of being a cultural Jew. I don't want to be reductive. So for example, there's a famous story, there's a kind of philanthropic Jew in Western Europe that emerges. So there's a guy named, for example, John King. He was known as the Jew King. He was born John Ray. His father gave him the name John to assimilate him, but Ray was too Jewish, so he changed it to John King. He became known as the Jew King, and in order to assimilate, what career does he choose? Moneylender. No joke. He became a moneylender. But why did he become a moneylender is a whole other story. There wasn't a lot of options for an upwardly mobile Jew in England in the 1800s. But the thing was, he was completely secular. He had no Jew. He married a non-Jew, and his name was Jew King and John King, and he hung out with non-Jews. But he gave a ton of money to the synagogue, and when he died, he left a ton of money to the orphanage and to all these places. It was his way of being Jewish. Like, I know I don't look Jewish. I do nothing Jewish other than being a moneylender, I guess. But like I'm married to a non-Jew. I hang out with non-Jews. He refuses to convert. And when he dies, he leaves money, to have a plaque. I mean, look, even Rothstein's got the biggest plaque of all. If you go to the synagogue in Upper West Side, what's it called? The famous one, at the center, the Jewish Center, right? where Norman Lamb of blessed memory used to be rabbi, and before him, other famous people. There's the Yortzeit plaques, and by far the biggest one is Rothstein. It's huge. The guy who fixed the World Series in 21, right? The gangster. He's got a massive plaque there, because that's how he's going to be Jewish, by having a huge plaque at the synagogue. So that's also a form of cultural Jewishness, which I don't want to disrespect. They play an important role, right? You got to have the plaques. You got to have the honorable whatever. Israel is a master at that. There's a famous joke about that, but they couldn't shoot the rocket off because they had all the plaques on. Anyway, other questions? I know it's 8, but I'm happy to stay. I'm home, so I got nowhere to go. I'm 10 feet from my bed, so really, whatever you need, I'm happy to stay. If there is any questions.
Judy, I think you're on mute.
Judy, are you talking? Because you're on mute. Yeah. Here she comes.
You.
Hi.
So this is a very dramatic question. It's all on all of our minds, especially us as parents and grandparents. How do we prevent assimilation? Historically, a very dominant culture swallows up the tiny minorities, no matter what their religion or what their culture, and those tiny minorities become assimilated. They can't resist the attractiveness and dominance of the majority culture. So,
well, that's been a struggle for Jews since the beginning of time, right? So, for example, when King Solomon took architectural styles and supplies from the Phoenicians and others to build the temple, that's kosher. That was godly and divine. But when they worshipped idols in there, no, you got to get destroyed, right? So that tension between, the whole idea, there's this tension between Athens and Jerusalem, right? Assimilation and authenticity. Hellenism completely reshaped Judaism, and for the better, I think. The entire notion of conversion is a Hellenist idea that we absorb from the Hellenists. There's tons of things we absorb from the Hellenists. I think Jews are constantly interacting with non-Jews, and for the better, because otherwise you're going to disappear. So it seems there's a famous essay by, who wrote that essay? Was it Rabinovich? I forget. The Jews, the ever-dying people. Like every generation, they think it's the last generation, but somehow we're still kicking around. So I don't know the answer. I do know that every denomination of Jews claims we are the way to the future. Everyone says we're the ones to guarantee the future. If you go with the other guy, you're going to, the Zionists say we're the future because there's going to be another anti-Semitism is going to destroy you and assimilation. You got to come to Israel or you're dead. The Orthodox say if you don't keep Orthodoxy, your kids will intermarry, they're going to disappear. The Reforms say if you don't adapt, then no one's going to want to be with, everyone has the claim that we're the ones who are going to. So I don't have an answer. I'm not a, ich bin nicht kein Navi, nicht ben Navi. I'm an historian, not a prophet. So I look backwards, not forwards. I can tell you that for a very long time, Jews have been worried about it, and yet we still seem to be sticking around. And sticking around in the diaspora, no less, by the way. That said, I will say something unusual is happening now, historically speaking. The diaspora is collapsing. The diaspora is collapsing in a way that has never happened in a ever really. And by that I mean, and Jonathan Sarna has a wonderful lecture on this, and I think he published it as an article. Jews used to be everywhere. Jews used to be all over in significant populations. They're all disappearing. And they're concentrating in a couple, Israel and America, but a couple other places, and that's it. Country after country, city after city, and within countries, city after city are emptying of Jews. And so Jews aren't going away, but that's changing their nature very dramatically. So that is new. But in terms of what's to prevent assimilation, it's hard to say. It's hard to know. But I will say that every denomination has the secret, and they all seem to have people who leave, and they all seem to attract people, and who knows what will be? Who knows what will be? The Sacks are raising their hands.
Yeah, will you be discussing the day school movement in America? Wasn't that an attempt to stem assimilation? And was there anything similar to that in other countries?
There were briefly day schools in Germany, but they didn't last very long. Ultimately, the Jews were accepted into the mainstream schools and the better ones, the gymnasia. And so they would have after-school schools and Sunday schools and things like that. They would maintain their identity in other institutions, the synagogues, the newspapers. Everyone subscribed to the newspapers and read them. Voluntary groups, you know, the 19th century equivalent of bowling leagues and hadassahs and things like that. And that way they sustained themselves. Day schools are pretty recent, as you know. 100 years ago, the Orthodox Jews went to public schools. There was an interesting article that came out maybe a year ago by a controversial, very smart scholar from Yale named Eli Stern, where he argued day schools are actually more likely to doom Orthodoxy than save it because of the cost. The cost of being a modern Orthodox Jew is insane. You know, a family could make $200,000 a year, and that's considered poor. And that's not sustainable. He says it's just not sustainable. And he argues, because he studied Russia in the late 1800s, a lot of Jews were leaving traditional Jewish life for material reasons, for bread, not because of ideology. In other words, traditional Judaism didn't answer the basic questions of persecution and food, right? So it was not attractive to them. And he argues that Orthodoxy, which seems to be celebrating this golden moment right now of retention and growth, he says it's not sustainable. The model is simply not sustainable because of the money. And Jews are it's going to happen again, he argues. They're going to leave because it's not sustainable. I don't know if he's right or wrong. Let's meet again in 30 years, God willing, and find out. But that's what he argues. I can tell you here in Skokie, a lot of Orthodox parents are sending their kids to Niles North. We lived, and this is a personal reveal, we personally moved to Skokie, west of Crawford, to keep Niles North as an option. So I don't know if my friends, if I'm just, what do they say? The plural of anecdote is not data. That my story does not mean it's a national story, but for what it's worth, that's my story. So, we'll see what happens. It's a good question. It's a very good question. Yeah, Judy, please.
So some of the factors that are dramatically changing the demography of Jews in America, and maybe some other, maybe South America, Canada, also Western Europe, is that Jews aren't getting married, they're not having children, and that is about assimilation, because everyone, typically wants their children to get married and have children. And the difficulty of Jews finding each other and marrying is been discussed for 20 years. What can the community do to facilitate that? Again, a sign of assimilation, the me generation, self-absorption, selfishness, etc. But I've been reading books by Professor Yohanan Petrovsky A. Stern from Northwestern.
Yeah.
This summer, right now, I'm working on one. And the Jews of Ukraine, my mother's side is from Ukraine, and I'm very interested in history.
Judy, you're breaking up on my, is it just my screen?
Ukrainians did not
No, it's all of us.
only went to Jewish schools until a certain time. Then they started going to public schools.
Yeah. So Judy, let me just cut you off. Just you're breaking up a little bit. Ukraine is a.
Shall I repeat that?
If you can do it quickly,
Jews
just because you're breaking up.
Oh. Okay.
If you maybe you want to type.
Ukraine went to Jewish schools. Type it. Okay.
Yeah, if you just type it, because I think it's a little bit broken up. While we're waiting for her question, is there any other questions while we're waiting for hers to come up? And I'll address it when I see it. God bless the chat function, right? I can pull it up now. If any other questions, okay, so I'll answer Judy's question, and then we can call it for tonight and continue in a week. but we're waiting for Judy's question to come up. I think she was about to ask me about Jews of the Ukraine before the Holocaust. If I'm not mistaken, because that's Yochanan's specialization. I will say while I'm waiting for a question, I'm personally skeptical of all the worries about assimilation and intermarriage. There's a lot of scholarship now on the children of intermarriages bringing in new, halacha is another question if the kids are Jewish or not, but Shaul Magid and a lot of other people have been writing about the need to have a more expansive view of continuity. And it's not my field of expertise, but there is scholarship on that. Shaul Magid wrote a book called Post-American Judaism or something like that, that addresses these things. So I'm waiting for the chat to come up. This is going to be quite the question. The anticipation is exciting. Elliot,
I wanted to just ask a quick question.
Sure, please.
Was there any sense of any of the thinkers or others who you discussed, any self-awareness of the project that they were undertaking? Any self-awareness in terms of recognizing the impact of the Enlightenment, recognizing that they need to try and construct something new, recognizing, and any degree of self-awareness about that?
That's a great question. Here I do see a difference between the denominations. I think that the Orthodox and the Zionists are less self-aware than the Reform and the Conservative or the Positive Historical. I think the Reform and the Positive Historical were far more self-aware of the project. You read Hirsch, right? From his perspective, he's recovering what was always a tradition that had been suppressed. And the Zionists will see the same thing, that they're recovering what had been suppressed. So in their minds, I think they're less aware. They know they're modern. Zionists know they're modern, that's clear. But I think that the sense of recovering what's lost I think the Reform are more aware of it. That's not to my mind that the Reform don't think they've done what's the most authentic Judaism, but I think they're a little more aware of the modernity project, to my sense. It's a great question, and it depends on who. The question I got was the Jews of the Ukraine went to Jewish schools until 1800. Yeah, Russia's a different story, and it depends when and where. Because the public schools, there is no public school system per se in Russia. It's a very confusing topic. And by and large, the vast majority of Jews in the 1800s, and Yochanan will tell you this, did not go to public schools, the vast majority. Interestingly, and I'll end with this, in Galicia, I'm not a Galicianer, happily, but I studied Galicia my whole life, and I spent a lot of time there. Galicia was part of Austria, and that was a Western state. That was a modern state. Jews were emancipated. They were fully equal citizens. If they had the money, if they had the income level required, they could vote. I mean, they were fully emancipated. The right of petition, the right of organization and press and all those things. They could move anywhere they wanted to live, all those things. So in Galicia, there was public school system and it was required to attend it. But there weren't enough seats for all the kids. The public schools taught Christianity. In Galicia, it depended. The Jews were allowed to have a Jewish teacher for those hours instead of a Christian teacher. But here's the funny thing about Galicia. In Galicia, and a book just came out about this, there weren't enough seats for everybody. So what became the practice was to send all the daughters first in the hopes that there wouldn't be enough seats for the boys to attend, and the boys would therefore be free to go to the Jewish school and study exclusively Torah. But think about this. After a few decades, all the girls go to public school and they read the Polish greats and Polish language and secular studies, and they get educated. They're modern Jews. They're Jews, but they're modern Jews. And the boys are going to cheder and they're going to yeshiva and so on, right? There's a mismatch there. There was a cultural crisis going on, which is the reason why the Beis Yaakov system, which began just after World War I, why does it begin in Krakow? Why does it begin in Galicia? It's because that's where the heart of the problem was. It's not a Russian problem. It was a Galician problem. And that's the reason why Beis Yaakov begins in Krakow and not in some city in the Russian Empire. It's connected to the unique history of Galicia. A new book which arrived at my desk literally yesterday on Shabbos Day by Rachel Manikin talks about this process. It talks about the Jews, by the way, who fled to Catholicism, who left altogether, and the Jews who didn't, the Jewish women who fled Judaism, who didn't flee Judaism. But that was a unique phenomenon in Galicia that didn't really happen in Ukraine and Russia. Galicia is Ukraine today, but it wasn't. When you say Ukraine, Judy, you mean Russian Ukraine. People don't usually think of Galicia, even though that was like the most Ukrainian part of Ukraine by far. To this day, Galicia is the most Ukrainian part of Ukraine. If you speak Russian language in Lviv today, you better know how to box because they're going to kick your behind, right? They sell toilet paper on the streets with Vladimir Putin's picture on it in a wrap. So that is the most Ukrainian part of Ukraine to this day. But when you think of Ukraine, they think of Kiev, they think of Russian Ukraine, which is a different story. Anyway, good question. Thank you all. It was a lot of fun. Have a wonderful week. Elliot, thanks for organizing.
Thank you, Josh. This is terrific.
And I'll see you, I hope to see you in a week. We'll do Zionism in a week.
Come back next week, same time, same channel.
Same bat time, same bat channel. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Josh.
Pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank you.